Hello and welcome to the latest Jacobin Talk. I am Nando Vila, co-host of Jacobin Weekends, and I am very, very excited to talk to the incomparable Mark Blyth today. Mark is a professor of international economics at Brown University, author of several books, including Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea, and Angrynomics. And he is one of my favorite people to listen to because he understands difficult things about the economy and money and debts and things like that. And he explains all of those things in a fun and witty way that regular old schmoes like myself can understand. But hello, Mark. How are you doing? How's it going? Thank you so much for talking to us.
Hello, old schmo. It's nice to be with you.
I guess I just want to start by asking you, what do you make of the current political moment? Obviously, a lot of news has happened in the last week or so, but we are seemingly transitioning from the Trump era to the Biden era. It's been very chaotic, but it looks like it's going to happen. And I guess I just want to see what your general sense is of the politics of the current moment.
I guess my first instinct is to kind of really wonder why we try and bind politics by presidential administrations. Right. So back in 2016, I did a piece called Global Trumpism that tried to suggest that Trump is a symptom as well as being causal. And the more he gets to do, the more he can cause. But he didn't come out of nowhere. Right. This guy came out of and is exemplary of a bunch of movements and a bunch of structural pressures that have been building in the global economy at least since the 1980s, which came to light in 2008. Which was covered up by a huge excess of central bank liquidity, putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, and then paying for that with austerity on the backs of the working classes. So it's not really a surprise that someone like that came out. Now, is this the end of his era? Well, the guy increased his vote share. He didn't just increase it amongst his white core voters. He increased it amongst the very people he set out to marginalize and insult. He increased it by 7 million votes. The Democrats barely squeaked through with a strategy electorally, which was designed to basically bring in urban, suburban, educated, public sector, and basically everyone I can think of except the sort of the American working class. It was an attempt to build a coalition around them, which they've been doing for the past couple of electoral cycles. Now, you put all that together, and I don't see the end of the Trump, I see the end of the Trump administration. I mean, basically, it's farcical. It's a fantasy. There's a wonderful quote from Voltaire I stumbled across today, which is to the effect of those who pander in illusions are set to perish by them, or something like this. And I think that sums up the moment. But at the same time, you know, the Biden era, I mean, come on, it's like a tribute band for the Obama administration with a couple of progressives thrown in. Now, is that better than the Trump administration? Infinitely. But does it mark the beginning of an era? I think that, you know, the owl of Minerva will be farting on the way out of the cage as she flaps her wings and buggers off.
Yeah, you know, that my reaction is kind of similar in that, like, I obviously wanted Trump out there very badly. I feel like it was very difficult to have any serious political talk or any political conversation while he was kind of dominating every single aspect of the discourse. And so I'm glad that he's gone. But as you mentioned, the coalition the Democrats have put together is a coalition that has never in any society ever delivered the kind of progressive change that we want to, this sort of upper middle class or, you know, upper income plus very, very wealthy elites. I mean, like every single, you know, billionaire for the most part is all on board the Biden train.
Yeah. I am the Democrats' median voter at this point. Right. And I occupy the top 5% of the wealth distribution and the top 1% of the social capital distribution. And I'm pretty much their median target. So, yeah, you're not really hitting the middle of the distribution by any means.
Right. And, you know, like you mentioned that this is like some sort of bad tribute band of the Obama era. And much like the Obama administration was walking in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, the Biden administration is walking into the coronavirus economic crisis. It's kind of like the history repeats itself. First is tragedy, then is farce. I guess I just want to ask you, what are the immediate economic effects of the pandemic? What are the possible long-term effects, and what can or should a Biden administration do to ameliorate them?
So the remarkable thing is, and let's be generous in spirit for a moment here, what's actually happened, even in the United States, is the type of fiscal largesse that people on the centre and the centre left have been calling for the past 20 years. So if you look at the financial response in terms of an actual fiscal response coming from governments in terms of taxes, spending, deficits, etc., that happened in 2008, and you scale that up to now, I mean, Japan is quite remarkable, has spent 40% of GDP on coronavirus amelioration. The OECD average is around 20%. We spent about 4 to 5% directly against the financial crisis. So the amount of fiscal muscle which has already been put in place is remarkable and tells you what the depth of the recession would be about it. So I find a useful way to think about it is this. We talk about stimulus. We need more stimulus. It makes it sound like people are going out and doing some kind of stimulus drug or something like this. A better way to think about it is insurance, right? Basically, you're falling off a cliff and someone is saying, can we afford the parachute? And the answer is yes, because if you don't have the parachute, it's going to be much, much worse when you hit the bottom, if you ever do. So in a sense, these are parachute payments. These are making sure that the curve that you get on is actually not the one that's utterly catastrophic. So there's been a huge amount of fiscal activism. Do I expect the Biden administration to continue this? Yes, because it's completely normalized at this point. Everyone is doing this. The Germans, the people who love austerity 7 ways to Sundays are doing this. Japan's doing this. Everybody's doing this. And we're doing it because we're being walloped with a really, really weird economic shock that's both simultaneously a supply shock, literally you're not making anything and you're sending people home, and consequently a demand shock as incomes from that basically crater. So when you're hit with that type of shock, not once but twice, and it lasts for 18 months, either you do enormous amounts of fiscal spending or your economy basically blows up. Now, the third aspect of this that we really have to get our heads around is Corona itself. What this crisis has shown is that your economy, to me at least, is a wholly owned subsidiary of your healthcare system. And if you have a shitty-ass healthcare system, like we do in the US, despite how much we spend on it, then you get a much, much worse recession. And if you actually have a pretty capable healthcare system that's able to cope with a public that isn't basically divided so that masks become a political issue, then you can weather the storm quite well. Go have a look at Denmark, not Sweden, but Denmark. You'll get good, better results that way. So I think that's sort of the lesson, is that we've already done right across the world a surprising amount. So if Biden does a bit more, that's not really a shocker. The shocker would be to go the other way and say, now is the time for austerity. And interestingly, hardly anyone publicly is saying this.
I guess I want to ask about that, because one of your books was Austerity, a very dangerous idea. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember the Obama era, when the big goal of the Obama administration was to strike some sort of grand bargain with Mitch McConnell, in which they basically instituted much more austerity than they even were able to. And you mentioned that idea, or the anti-austerity, I guess, has been somewhat normalized. Is it just that all these people woke up, like read your book, or what are the structural factors behind it? Why is it normalized?
Entirely reading my book.
Yeah,
it's my book, absolutely. No, well, there is, the teaching of experience. So why did Brexit happen? Now, you can't draw a straight line to this, but there's a lot of research out there that's very, very well done that shows that it's very much correlated, particularly in those so-called red wall constituencies in the north, with the impact of austerity under Cameron, right? So when you take people that already weren't doing all that well, their income had been on the slide for a long time, and then when you basically blow up in a financial crisis and then put the cost of adjustment on them and not London. My statistic from this, a town in the north of England called Preston, which is completely dependent on central transfers. The only part of the British economy that grows, it creates value added that gives you GDP growth, is basically London. The rest of it lives on transfers. Preston lost 30% of its budget in real terms. London lost 4%, right? So the asymmetry of the put that was put on people was absolutely horrendous. Let's look at Southern Europe. They had a 10-year-long recession only because they did austerity and continued to do it. Italy went into this pandemic with around 12 to 13% unemployment. They have the third biggest bond market in the world and the 17th biggest economy. They haven't grown in 20 years. and they don't have a currency of their own to manipulate or otherwise spend or create inflation or anything. So there you've got an economy that has a structural growth problem and a huge debt problem. If you put austerity on Italy, that bond market blows up and Italian fascism comes back very, very quickly. The two strongest parties just now in Italy are both fascist parties, the Fratelli and the Liga. And together, they're almost the majority. So I don't think people in Brussels and elsewhere are actually completely ideologically driven and unable to process information. They realize that long-term, they're going to have an issue with low growth and a large amount of debt. That's a fact. Is now the time to try and solve that in the middle of basically heightened febrile populism and a huge inequality problem? Probably not.
I want to ask about that a little bit, because there's kind of a joke amongst liberals here in this country. Whenever they see Trump supporters doing something awful, like storming the Capitol, they'll make a joke saying, "Oh, look at all this economic anxiety," meaning like it's a rebuke to the sort of left analysis of what's going on politically. The chaos politically is driven largely by the 2008 financial crisis and the inability of the system to deal with it properly. And it used to be kind of a mainstream conventional wisdom thing that fascism, extreme far right-wing politics was found fertile ground in the wake of something like a financial crisis, like in the 1930s. Right. But that's been the sort of conventional wisdom at the center, and the liberals has totally rejected that kind of analysis into something that's only racism and it's only kind of white supremacy or whatever. But the presence of this phenomena all over Europe, not just in the United States, leads me to believe that it's not just due to the unique nature of American kind of relationships with race. So, what is your general take on that?
I think you've half answered the question. You can't generalize from one case to 30 cases around the world where you have left-wing populism as well as right-wing populism. The second thing is basically what I call what anyone calls a prime mover unmoved problem. You can't explain a rise in racism by reference to a rise in the number of racists. That's just circular, right? Something has to be causing that. A very simple counterfactual. Go look at periods of real wage growth in the United States or anywhere, and then look at the incidence of right-wing parties and populist parties exploding onto the scene and taking 20% of the vote. Zero, right? So when things are growing, these things just really don't matter. When things have been, and this is what the economic research shows in multiple countries, when you have a bunch of old people whose economy locally has been on the slide, right? Basically, it's all in the delta, it's all in the rate of change, right? Going down, regardless of the overall income level, right? You can be relatively rich and stay relatively rich. You can be relatively poor and get even more relatively poor. If you've got those two factors together, you're pretty much primed for a populist response. What matters, what weaponizes this, and whether it goes into a left-wing or right-wing direction, is politics. And the United States has trucked in racism since its founding, has basically indulged in everything from the failure of Reconstruction through the birth of Jim Crow, the exclusion of African Americans through the New Deal period, the failure of Great Society to fully include them, the complete collapse of the industrial economy, particularly affecting African Americans who'd moved into those jobs, the collapse of the inner cities, the war on drugs. Where do we end with how much this community has been hit? And it has race at its core. But you know what? At the end of the day, those are economic exclusions and not purely social exclusions. And I deeply worry that if you are someone who wants to see greater racial justice, if there's not an economic component to the causes, why then would there be an economic component to the redress? Right? How can you make a case for reparations or anything if ultimately this is about status anxiety? Right? And finally, if there's an economic problem, there are solutions. It's called redistribution, growth, taxes, whatever you want to do. If it's basically an essentialist conflict between two interpretations of the moral philosophy of man, I'm out. We're done. Because there's no solution to that one, right? Other than we all kill each other. And I don't think that's a really good idea for public policy in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you mentioned briefly at the top, that Trump actually increased his voter share amongst, for example, Latinos, very specifically and very dramatically in places like South Texas near the border, where there was a huge kind of fiscal influx due to Trump's obsession with the border wall, and tons of Latinos living there getting jobs essentially as a result of it. So they weren't.
But hold on, not just that, right? Like, and I really get this, right? I come from a line of not just Catholic conservatives. I actually come from a line of Catholic fascists, right? My grandparents.
Me too, by the way, from Spain.
Yeah, they were basically brown shirts, right? They thought Mosley was a great guy, right? The whole thing. Now, what is it that they believed in? What was Franco's revolution? Franco launched his revolution with 3 words: honor, God, country. Right? These people are hierarchy. This is exactly where the culturalists are right? This is about hierarchy. This is about dominance, etc. But why do they find their moment in those particular moments? Because of the economics that makes it possible. Right? That's when they find their expression. That's when their latent organization in churches and social groups, etc., comes to the fore. Right? That's when the networks that they have matter. But it's only activated because of those economic conditions. Otherwise, you've got a question: why now? If it's not that, if it's not the inequalities, if it's not the things that have been building up for 30, 40 years, if it's not the fragilization of labor markets, if it's not the increasing stress of the workplace, what is it that made it happen now? That's what we need to focus on.
Well, I'm very glad to be talking to the fellow spawn of Catholic fascists. There's very few of us, but we still
there's
exist.
Millions. Do not doubt it. There's millions.
Well, at least in the Jacobin milieu. In the Jacobin milieu, there's not many.
Jacobin milieu, that's true.
Yeah. I want to ask about the CARES Act that passed last summer in the United States, because it was, to me, a remarkable piece of legislation that I also barely understand on some level, because first of all, it happened very quickly, and it was passed in like 15 minutes. And on the one hand, it did create the $1,200 checks and the expansion of unemployment insurance, which was actually quite generous, at least by the United States' standards. And I know plenty of people who were like living pretty, like they were like enjoying that government largesse. But on the other hand, it had this component of like a Fed bailout of corporations that, again, for someone like me, is very difficult to understand how that works. Like what the Fed just gave them money. Like where does that? I don't understand how that. Where did it come from, and how does it work?
Would you like to understand how that happened?
I would. Yes, please.
All right. Okay. So here's how to think about it. Have you ever had a plumber in your house?
Yes.
Right. So plumbers are magicians. You have no idea what they're doing, right? I'm just need to rip up your floor and do stuff. Okay, big man, go for it, right? Financial plumbing is very similar. Now, the way that the Fed is set up, the Fed basically the Treasury makes money, technically speaking, whatever you want to do, right? But ultimately, the Fed credits banks. So there's very big financial pipes that basically push money out to these 25 financial institutions. They then basically swap bonds for this, and they get more money or less. You manage your reserves that way. You can get some control over interest rates. And then we leave it to slightly smaller pipes, those big banks, to give that out to the rest of the private sector. And then the private sector does with that money what it does with that money, right? There are no pipes that go from the Fed to households. There are no pipes that go directly from the Fed to small businesses. So when they made the Small Business Administration the conduit for these loans, basically it was like taking the world's largest fire hose and sticking it into a garden sprinkler and expecting it to work. Right? The volume just overwhelmed it and the whole thing crashed. So, of course, what you then do is you go, see, the Fed cares about Wall Street. It doesn't care about Main Street. That may or may not be true, but also they literally don't have the pipes to get the money there. Now, interestingly, two things that are going in the background here. All central banks are getting very interested in digital currencies. Why are they getting interested in digital currencies? Because Zuckerberg scared the crap out of them with the idea of Libra. If you could have a private currency to settle your contracts, you basically destroy the ability of central banks to have effective monetary policy. The second one was Bitcoin. It turns out that loads of people in the world don't actually think that the endless printing of money is a good idea, and they're willing to put their money into a digital gambling asset with high volatility rather than trust the politicians. So what this has meant is that right across the world, China's already rolling this out, the Swedes are rolling this out, the Americans have a digital greenback proposal that they're going to move on, is that we're going to actually invent those pipes. And it's not hard to do. Hardly anyone knows this, but if you go to the Treasury, you can go to the Treasury and just Google Treasury Direct. You can open up an account with the Treasury that basically you can buy bonds and all that, like just right there and then, put your credit card details in, off you go, right? Or bank details. There's no reason you can't reverse that and do it at the Fed, so that the next time there is a recession, rather than having to go to Congress and fight about this and fight about that, you can just drop $1,000 a month into everybody's account until the recession's over. And then if you're worried about the fact that you spent too much money, you could raise taxes and bring it back. So there's a way in which they're aware of this. There's a way in which there's movement behind the scenes to make sure that there's a better way of doing this. But again, the politics of this were fascinating, because the question is, who authorizes the Fed to do this? What exactly is the status of democratic oversight? Where exactly is the choice or the will of the legislature? Now, given the way the legislature in the United States works just now and who controls it and so on and so forth, you might think that's a good thing. But in my estimation, basically sort of well-meaning technocrats with incomplete information and bad models kind of got us into this mess. And giving them even more tools and more power might be better than giving it to Ted Cruz, but by how much?
You know, I didn't expect to ask about Bitcoin, but since you brought it up, because, speaking of another thing I barely understand, the only thing I know about it is that in my personal life, like only the most annoying people I know are the biggest evangelists of it, and I barely understand it. But
so true. That is so true.
It's just they're super annoying. I don't know why. Like they were annoying before the Bitcoin, and then the Bitcoin just made them even more annoying. But
it's also it's a bit like, the left-wing equivalent is the hardcore of MMT, where they've kind of discovered the truth about the world, and if you disagree with it, you're obviously an idiot. It's like I feel Bitcoin people and those people on the same, they're like the same echo bouncing off my head, basically. It's the same level of kind of smug intolerance.
Right. But I think that philosophically, one thing, I mean, I barely understand the technology of it, but philosophically, like what you mentioned, that a government like the United States cannot tolerate they cannot allow, like if Bitcoin was ever like a real thing, a real threat to it, they would shut it down in 5 seconds. So I just don't, but is there a world in which these annoying people are right and it is the future, or is it just kind of a fad or something?
So that's really fascinating, because ultimately, money is a very storied and complex thing. And one of the ways that money, historians in particular and sociologists like to think about money as a kind of social convention. And it's a useful way of thinking about it. I mean, you can also think about it as a product. You can also think about it as a host of other things. But if you're thinking about a convention, what it means is I'm willing to hold this bit of paper or this digital thing somewhere in a digital register that says that it's worth 10,000 of something. That represents a certain store of value to me. And in X amount of time, I can go back and it will still be worth 10,000. Well, the problem starts when people start to believe that it's not going to be worth 10,000. It's going to be worth 9,000. It's going to be worth 8,000. And then you start to look at, well, what can I get as a hedge, right? What moves the other way? Well, it used to be you would buy equities in the market and then you would buy government bonds, because when one went up, the other one went down, and vice versa. There was a balance. That no longer works now, because bonds yield the square root of zero, and equities keep going through the roof, and that suggests that there's a bubble. So if you think that there's a problem in the sense that because of COVID, but because of also wider governmental dysfunction, we're just printing money like it's going out of fashion, which by some accounts we are, and that's a problem. If you think that, whether it is or not, we can debate, right? And we could make an argument if you want to go there about why it's not, right? But some people do think that it is, right? Some people do think that the United States has overextended itself. Some people do think the dollar is going to fail, which is the global currency. If you're worried about all that stuff, we've got a choice. It's called gold or Bitcoin, because they're both fear indexes. Whenever you get worried, the price of that stuff goes up. And in a sense, they've given up on gold, and now they're going for digital gold. So the People's Bank of China a couple of years ago gave a ruling on what Bitcoin was, and they called it a digital gambling asset. And I think that's exactly what it is, because it's too volatile to be a store of value unless it's constantly going up, as it has been for a while. But, is it a unit of account? Like, nobody counts like, the value of the guitars on my wall in units of Bitcoin. It's too volatile, right? Is it a unit of exchange, right? Do you use it? No, right? So what is it? It's a digital gambling asset for rich people who are totally paranoid about the future.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that because I know one guy who's like one of the dumbest people I've ever met in my life, but like had a little money from some inheritance, not a huge amount, and put it all in Bitcoin, and now like has so much money that he doesn't even know what to do with it. And I'm like, I look at this guy and I'm like, how is this? This is so wrong on so
He
many
wasn't
levels.
dumb. He wasn't dumb.
Yeah.
You were, and
I'm
were,
dumb. Yeah.
because we thought we understood how the world worked, but he didn't. No, but there's really important information in this, right? It's not about what's true about the world, right? Is government debasing the economy, right? What matters is whether people believe that's true. That's the convention aspect. That's why it's much more fragile and contingent than we like to think, right? So if enough people really believe the dollar's screwed, the dollar's screwed. It's that simple, right? So, you know, that's what Bitcoin feeds off of, right? And that's a very real thing in the world, even if it's inherently subjective.
Right. Well, and now I have to ask you about the flip side of Bitcoin, because you mentioned it as MMT. What is, like, you sound like you're skeptical at best. What is your take on the modern monetary theory?
Look, I get beaten up by them whenever I disagree with them.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to get you in trouble.
No. I'm going to get Twitter shit for this and all the rest of it. But look, honestly, I'm the Fox Mulder of MMT. I want to believe, like, I really, really want to believe, right? Like Fox Mulder, I just keep coming up against stuff where I'm like, right? I mean, basically, it depends how far we could do a whole program on this. Like, I think honestly, it only applies to the United States. It depends upon somebody having a hegemonic currency. That is to say, pretty much everybody else who earns stuff abroad earns in your currency and has to convert it in one way or another into an asset in your currency so that you can run an infinite deficit and other people basically supply the capital to fill it, right? Then it makes sense. But even then, it's contingent upon things like, the control of the House and the Senate and the presidency for about 3 terms in a row in order to do all the stuff you want to do, which is basically rewrite the Federal Reserve Act, replumb the Treasury, disintermediate the entire banking system, tame Wall Street. And at the end of the day, like, what you're trying to do is essentially say, you know what, we could spend a lot more on the stuff that we care about. I totally agree. Right? Are there capacity limits to the economy? Yeah, but we're probably nowhere near them. You just need to walk around anywhere except the rich parts of the United States, and you can't tell me that this place doesn't need infrastructure. It doesn't need investment. And it's also true right now that every OECD sovereign can issue bonds, can issue debt at a negative real rate going forward, which basically means if you issue a 10-year German debt, right, and you're getting $100, you spend €100, you buy €100 German bond. In real terms, because of a negative real rate, after 10 years, you're basically getting back about 80 euros, right? The investor is. So they're paying you to borrow. And there's no inflation anywhere, right? For reasons that nobody really understands. I mean, MMT gets criticized for not having a theory of inflation, but you know what? Nobody has a theory of inflation now. We don't know where it was gone. It just disappeared. But in those financing conditions, you've already got the plumbing. You've got a bond market, and investors are paying you to take their money and go do something productive with it. Why do I need to basically reinvent everything in the world when the bond market already allows me to do it? And that's for the United States. Now, you know, I'm Scottish, right? There's a lot of people in Scotland who are very captivated by MMT as a solution to the problem of getting a currency in an independent Scotland. And the argument is, well, you need an independent monetary policy. You can set your own interest rates, and this will help. Well, again, it's like, I wish it was true. You know, dirty little secret, shock horror. Hardly anyone sets their own independent monetary policy because the dollar's so damn dominant. We have what's called a global credit cycle. There's an economist called Helene Ray and others have written about this. Gita Gopinath has also written about it. That essentially, for every dollar that's borrowed and lent in the United States, there's like 5x or 6x outside in the world in what are called euro-dollar markets. And the pressure of all that money flying around, and also the fact that every exporter is earning dollars and needs to turn those dollars back into an asset, and it can't put those dollars in its own banking system, so they end up buying US debt, creates the structural pressure that the only bank that ever matters in central banking terms is the Fed. When the Fed goes up, everyone goes up. When the Fed goes down, it goes down. So this is a myth to start with. The second one is the caveat in MMT at the bottom that you get in the introductory text, which you read and then you forget, is that this applies to any country that can reasonably well provision itself. Well, we're not in the 18th century anymore. This isn't sort of like how many chickens have you got in the back of the coop, right? This is, do you have the rare earth metals you need to do x-rays of cancer? Do you make your own skateboards, right? Do you make cars? Do you not? Because if not, you're going to have to import them, right? Do you actually grow enough food to actually import the food that you need? Well, if you do, then you're going to have a problem, because if you just suddenly crank up the printing presses and people, for whatever reason, get a bit nervous about that and your exchange rate goes down, your imports get massively expensive. Suddenly you're going to get inflation through the import channel. And if you can't substitute out, which basically we can't really do that in the modern world with global supply chains and stuff, you're going to have a huge fiscal problem. So these are the hard constraints. These are my Fox Mulder moments, right? I wish I could believe, but I literally have never seen a good answer to these problems. Now, the minute somebody actually gives me that and says, like, Mark, really, this is it. This is what you don't get. I've tried. I've had multiple conversations with people who are in the club, but I just don't get it.
For all you Zoomers in the audience, Fox Mulder references from the X-Files. Check it out on your local streaming service. I want to ask you.
I tell you one. This is my I am really old moment, right? Yeah. So without going into too much details, I have a personal connection with Sean Connery. So when Sean Connery died,
I thought every Scottish person was just.
Well, we all do. We all knew him basically personally, right? Yeah. But no, for real, I did, right? So when he died, it was a bit of a sad one for me. So I went to. I was out shopping and I went to the bank, and I know that the folks in the local bank, and they're like, "What's going on?" And I'm like, "It's kind of a bummer, Sean Connery died." Actually, had a personal connection, and somebody who was about 40 or 50 was like, "Oh, really?" And honestly, there was a woman who was 30 who was like, "Who's Sean Connery?" And at that moment, I was just like, "Oh my God! If I said to you one ping for Shelley, just one ping, you would have no idea what I'm talking about, right?" That's when you know. That's when you know you're old. It's over.
Yeah, I suddenly remembered my Charlemagne. I want to ask you about a question that's just been on my mind, and there's been some sort of intra-left disagreement on it, which is the latest round.
Arguing with itself?
Yeah. Shocker.
Left argues with itself. Shocker.
Yeah. It's about the latest government cases for antitrust on Google and Facebook. I know some people are very big on sort of antitrust. Other people on the left are saying that that's just, it's not important how big the companies are. What's your take on the latest round of antitrust cases against Google and Facebook, given that they're, these are the biggest companies in the history of the world?
Is it the fact that they're big that's the problem, or is it the fact that you value competition, right? Now, this is not something that the left is usually accused of, valuing competitive markets. But the critique for antitrust is basically they buy up the competition, they stifle innovation, and they can make monopoly profits. Now, that's only a problem if you actually care about competitive markets, because you believe at the end of the day that actually gives ordinary people more bang for the buck. Their dollar goes further, right? And it creates the right incentives for business so that they don't become basically rent-seeking monopolists that destroy future technology, etc. So I can understand why, if you don't care about that, as some parts of the left just don't care about that, then that's not a problem. Is it a problem to me? Yeah, but it's part of a bigger set of problems. This is, just one aspect of what we've been doing for the past 30 years, which is to essentially fragilize labor markets, shove all the costs onto labor, give all the benefits to capital, watch their margins go up, and then basically watch the returns to labor go down. But what's happened is neoliberalism, as a set of policies and ideas and practices that brought us this contemporary world, what's actually happened is a kind of a schadenfreude moment, to use that wonderful German word, whereby when it was released on labor markets, that was the expected outcome, right? We're going to destroy all these cartels. We're going to get rid of these unions. We're going to free up labor and free up capital, but labor can't go anywhere, but capital can. So that means you can get to invest more and you can get what you take what's left over, right? But the funny thing is it also started to happen in product markets, right? So let's think about a few things. As you can see, I'm sitting here with a bunch of guitars. These guitars, well, I mean, this one's a bit of a rarity, but I mean, some of these are just commercially available things. I've got a drum kit over in the corner. When I was a kid, right, a drum kit was something that cost, I mean, in contemporary terms, like $2,000. Now you can buy a decent 5-piece kit for about $300. right?
Mm.
Think of the cost of technology, how much an iPad cost when it came out, and then how much the Samsung equivalent, which by the way is better, like cost, a couple of $100, right? So what's been happening is the margins of companies has been getting crushed. There's a hugely competitive world out there in terms of the global economy. But there's very few firms at the top that control the intellectual property rights, that control the supply chains, that control the extraction of the value in those supply chains. And they happen to be firms like the digital giants of the United States, the digital giants of China, and a handful of other firms, Apple's key suppliers, and then everybody else down the supply chain is making less and less and less. There's a political economist who I deeply admire called Herman Schwartz, who's writing a great deal about this. And his analysis on this is brilliant. There's a similar analysis by someone called Brett Christophers, who just did a book called Frontier Capitalism, Who Owns the Economy, which is a deep dive into the United Kingdom. And, what you see with Google and Amazon, you can see the same thing in sector after sector. One or two dominant firms that basically own assets, protect them with legal protections, sweat the assets, and then squeeze labor. That's increasingly becoming the business model across sectors, and that's the real problem. So to me, in a sense, Google and Amazon are like emblematic of it, embedded in it, are part of it. But, simply going after them isn't going to solve the overall problem, which is when you release neoliberalism onto product markets, you get the same inequalities amongst capital as you now get amongst labor. And that has its own fragilizing effects.
And related, what did you make of the social media companies banning Trump from their platforms?
Again, it's a really interesting question. You're defending free speech by banning someone, right? Well, okay. I mean, I think you can take this too far. It goes back to the Voltaire quote, right? I mean, you can say there's power and absolute power and all that sort of stuff, and these people have absolute power and it's corrupting, etc. Well, on the other hand, you can say, if you trade in fantasy and falsehoods, eventually you cause atrocities and somebody has to be responsible. So they finally figured out, holy shit, if we keep this going, there's going to be some atrocities and they're going to come and blame us, right? Now, as private sector actors, they can let in who they want. They are not public service entities. They tend to put up with Trump and people like Trump because they're world leaders, and therefore they know they're going to get lots of followers. So therefore there's lots of data to mine and all the rest of it. Or to be more kind, there's a public interest in hearing what they have to say. But essentially, Trump's outlived his usefulness. That's pretty much it. Now, is this a problem for free speech? It's a really interesting question, because if free speech can only be expressed through a monopoly, I think Branko Milanovic had a good couple of tweets about this today. If free speech can only be provided by a monopoly platform, you don't have free speech.
No.
Right? I mean, if the only place you can have free speech is on a monopoly platform, have a think about what you mean by free speech. Because what you mean is maximal contact. And that is going through private sector pipes, to go back to pipes again. Right. So I think it raises some very interesting questions about what we mean. I think we still have this kind of like 19th century notion of free speech in our heads, but it's provided by 21st century digital platforms, which are inherently exclusionary and exist to mine your data and basically abuse, what you give them. So, that's a bit of a thorny issue.
Yeah. Well, let's say you and I rediscovered our fascist roots and led a successful coup d'etat and became dictators of the United States. What would be your priorities in terms of what should be like our priority on the left? Like, what should we rebuild the welfare state? If so, which one should we start? Should we rally around Medicare for all, or should we do Green New Deal, or should we do both at the same time? Like, what should be like our kind of priority list if we were in power?
So the first one is don't do that, right? Just don't do that. It's a very bad thought experiment. If you've ever spent 5 minutes in a faculty meeting, the last thing you want is government by professors and well-meaning lefty technocrats. It's just no, for God's sake, no. So I don't think that's right. I think the prior question is, why is it that Trump has a base and we don't, right? That's really the interesting one. Why is it that he has walked into politics 4 years ago, breezed in, and created a coalition that basically lost an election by this much in a half a dozen states after winning it by this much in half a dozen states? Why is it that we have this kind of top-down technocratic fetish for policy? whereby our fellow citizens who are not as rich as us are seen as some kind of social problem to be managed, rather than a citizenry to be embraced, listened to, mobilized, and put in a direction for a more progressive politics. We don't do that. We don't engage. We don't talk to the people that we supposedly represent. And then we get surprised why they despise us, because they see through the hypocrisy of that stance. So I think long before what we're going to do and what we're going to fix, I think we have to have a good look in the mirror and recognize that what we're failing to do is to engage the very people that we supposedly want to represent, and to listen to them and take this seriously without without prejudice to what they say, even if they themselves are prejudiced. Otherwise, what are we here for?
So it sounds like, you know, it's a cultural problem within the left, or is there sort of like structural problems to it? Because I mean, again, like this, it's the same thing as the sort of rise of right-wing populism. It's the same thing is happening all over the Western world. It's happening here as it's happening in Europe. So is it just because it? I mean, it strikes me that it sounds like it's a cultural issue as well as some sort of structural issue as to why we haven't been able to engage. The working classes, like you mentioned.
You know, apart from my defense of, you know, economic explanations of things like populism, you know, 2 cheers for culture. All economic facts are culturally mediated, right? What is regarded as an efficient market outcome in the United States, private healthcare, is regarded as a social abomination in parts of Europe, right? So facts as economic facts are only understood through the cultural frames in which we understand them. What happened is that the left, to the extent that it ever existed in the United States as a real governing force, its cultural frame shifted in the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s away from one that attended to the core of the working class and working class concerns and working class organizations and communities to basically, as the right calls it, the coastal elites and the industries of wealth generation. Now, of course, the right was basically in exactly the same thing, bankrolling that and doing a much nastier version of it. But essentially, we all started chasing the same pockets of money. Right? We started chasing the same voters, the same 20% at the top who determine elections. And once you do that, who do you actually represent? What are you for, right? The Democratic Party was the party of working Americans, and it still says that, but it's simply not true. It's not clear that the GOP are, but they make a good show on pretending they are, which is actually more than what we do. When I listen to people who intellectually I actually really respect, like Elizabeth Warren, and I hear I've got a policy for that, I cringe, because I want to hear I've got a politics that will excite you. I've got a politics that will mobilize you. I've got a politics that will make you see through what they're saying is deeply, deeply harmful to you, and you should actually think like us. But if thinking like us is, you know, there's been a randomized controlled study of that shows that people who are on, I mean, really? I mean, this is what we're going to do? So, you know, technocracy has its virtues, but I think it's also a terrible, terrible weakness. And it's brought the Democratic Party in particular to a point whereby it kind of voxes itself to death.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And you know, there's been kind of some people that are advocates of this kind of realignment in American politics, of this kind of maybe you can get the kind of progressive populism, whatever you like, through the Republican Party, because culturally the Democratic Party has become so toxic to working class voters. I mean, you know, just Nancy Pelosi as kind of like the figurehead of the Democratic Party is just like everything a working class person would hate in every single sense of the word.
I'll give you another one here, right? Now, as a governor, I got to say, in comparison to Trump's press briefings, Gina Raimondo was like, you know, a Nobel Prize winning peace advocate, right? She came out, she talked about facts, she told you why nursing homes were so bad. She said, here's what we're doing and this is what we need to do. It was clarity. It was wonderful, right? But at the same time, you know, this is somebody who's going to be Commerce Secretary in Biden's cabinet. Okay, well, what's her qualifications for that apart from being a reasonable governor? She used to run a private equity firm, a venture capital firm, right? That's the type of people that the Democrats draw from these days. There's a piece that I posted on Twitter long before the election. It was a study that somebody did, a media studies person, and it was really, really interesting. Who do these parties draw from? And what you find is the Ivies are, the Democrats are Ivy League plus. So it's the Ivy plus Berkeley and maybe one or two schools. Everybody knows each other. Everybody networks, right? It's DC, New York, a bit of LA, and a bit of Miami. That's basically the whole damn thing. You look at where the Republicans draw from. They draw from public universities. They draw from a much wider part of the country. They actually have ties into those communities that we show up once every 4 years and say, that's a bad man. They've already priced in he's a bad man. That's not going to tip anything, right? So we're just not connected in a way that's necessary to be a credible political organization with 80 million people who basically feel, for a multitude of reasons, that for the past 30 years, they're the ones that have been paying the bill, while people like us have been living on the top.
So I guess but that's, again, that's the root of my question. You know, obviously you're right that all these sort of analyses about the Democratic Party are correct, but we're also not going to become Republicans, and we don't really have. I mean, right? We're not going to. I mean, I don't buy like that. You know, these like kind of right wing populists are a real meaningful thing. So we're not going to become Republicans. So we're kind of stuck with the Democrats in a way, but that also tars our image in the eyes of a lot of working class people. So we're kind of stuck. I guess is my question: is how do we break out of that? Here's
why you're stuck, and it has to do with the dynamics of the country itself. And like I was on Paul Jay's podcast, and I came up with this. I was quite chuffed that I did because I think it's quite good. So I'm going to do it again. Which is the Democrats have to deal in structural hypocrisy. And here's what I mean by this. You remember after the election, there was a heated phone call amongst top Democrats about why they didn't take the House. And what happened was people on the progressive left got on the phone and basically said, you people, you know what? You're giving us shit for talking about socialism, right? You're talking about the stuff that we care about. You think that cost you Miami? Well, let me tell you, where do you think Georgia came from? Where do you think Michigan came from? It came exactly from activists on the left, and it came from people who cared about Black Lives Matter, etc. So shut the hell up. Now, that's absolutely true. But you know what? Talking about socialism in Miami did cost you Florida. Right? because more people have left Venezuela as economic migrants and political refugees than left Syria. And a lot of them have shown up in the United States. And if you walk up to them and start saying, I want to talk meaningfully about social democracy and socialism, all they hear is, I need to kill you, right? So the diversity of the country is such that you do not have one sort of side that we can play that basically speaks to all these constituents, which is why the Democrats do these types of triangulations of the minimal winning coalition they can, because ultimately they're caught. They've got structural hypocrisy. They get their money from Wall Street, but they want to do the best deal for Main Street. They want to take Florida, but at the same time, they want to talk about social democracy. You can't have it all ways in this country. It's too tough. Whereas the Republicans have got just a great scam. Freedom, more money for me, screw you. There you go.
You know, I would be remiss if I didn't ask an audience question that came through. Someone asked, I can't help but wonder what's in Mark's record collection right now.
Very good question. I haven't actually been listening to that much new music, sadly. I've been playing it, as you can see. This was my lockdown therapy. There's a drum kit over there. The mic is inside an old Mac monitor, or I turn around and show it. And I've mainly been playing. In terms of what I've been playing along to, that could be an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
What have I been playing along to? I've been playing along to stuff I can play. So what have I been playing along to? I've been playing along to Talking Heads, which is surprisingly straightforward. Squeeze is surprisingly difficult. They throw a lot of stuff in there, like as a drummer, you're like, what was that?
Squeeze, like tempted by the fruit of another?
Yeah, exactly. Some of that's really straightforward,
yeah.
Right? But some of the stuff they play is really quite interesting. So I've been kind of getting on a kind of, maybe this is lockdown depression showing itself, that essentially I've been going on a kind of very cool 70s and 80s pop rock nostalgia trip. That's basically what I've been getting into. In terms of anything that's dreadfully new, it's probably my daughter battering me with stuff in the car. So I have to say that I do like Sia. I've got a definitely Sia. Yeah, I think that's pretty much where we're going.
Yeah, she's an excellent singer. Well, I don't know, Cale, do you want to come on? I know Cale, the producer, he's a very smart lad. He's a young Zoomer.
Sure, I'll represent my people.
Do you have any questions for Mark?
Well, so I wanted to grab one from the audience as well.
Sure.
Alex in the chat was asking, what are your thoughts on degrowth? Is this just a wind down of other sectors such as extraction and disposable consumerism? And how politically unviable is? I guess the questioner sounds like they're not super on board with it. Disclosure: I'm not. I don't fully subscribe to it, but I was curious what you make of it. What is degrowth? How does it? What is the logic of it? And is it viable politically?
This is a whole conversation that I'd love to have. So, I'm not going to take you another 10 minutes, but let me try and do this as short as I can. Some of this is a confusion between the measurement and what is being measured. So the obsession with GDP growth, right? So essentially, because you put everything with a dollar sign on it, and then you divide it by the number of people in the population, the output of a country, etc. So more output is good, regardless of the distribution, is what really matters. So there's an argument about we really should be focusing on the distribution rather than aggregate, growth in the aggregate. And if growth itself is carbon-based and damaging, then yeah, we need less of that. I don't think that is disputable. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The baby boomers forgot to have enough kids. Millennials have a huge amount of debt and don't get married and have even less kids. And the people who vote everywhere have decided they don't like immigrants, which means that you're going to have a shrinking population. Because you're going to have a shrinking population then, and a lot of old people you need to take care of, then you're going to have a low rate of growth anyway. And what that means is, as you add every incremental person, if you're actually not growing, you're going to get poorer. So you kind of have to, in some sense, grow. It may not be GDP growth, but it's kind of built into it, right? Third problem, the donut, right? Branko Milanovic, again, has done really good stuff on this. It's a great image, a great metaphor. But let's think about this for a minute. The disparity in the global income distribution is so large that if you really want to basically bring the very bottom up to basically the 10th percentile of the OECD, you would have to affect the largest income transfer in human history on a scale of which that makes literally Pol Pot and Stalin look like they didn't really try hard enough, right? If you want to take it from the top, even just averaging it out, let alone taking it from the very top, because that's all in tax havens and is really hard to get, right? You would basically have to take the OECD average income from about 14,000 down to about 7,000 to make a meaningful difference. It's really hard to say to people in the OECD countries, hey, lads, I've got a great idea for sustainability. How about you halve your income, but just give it to everybody else, right? It's just, that's a tough sell. That's a really tough sell. Now, there are other aspects of this, the work on the circular economy, recycling, biomaterials, the scientific frontier of this sort of stuff, whereby you can do a lot more with less, etc. Nobody's ever really cracked recycling, right? We just kind of do a shitty job of it. If you could ever get really good at it, then you get huge gains in efficiency, and then you get much better forms of growth. So I think that, I think it's much more complex than it seems. In the aggregate as a truth, it's kind of appealing, but it's a bit like, other things. Once you start to pick away at it, I become less sure of what it means. What I absolutely hate it is I was in Prenzlauer Berg, which is a sort of once poor Eastern, now super bourgeois part of East Berlin. I've got 2008. I lived there for about 6 months. And I ran into lots of people there who are very much into the sort of degrowth. And I thought, well, this makes sense because you're all 50. You live in a huge welfare state. You bought an apartment for like 5 kopecks and it's now worth $300,000. And essentially you've got all you need. So why does anyone need to grow? And it's a bit like that, the English middle class word, which I can't stand, called thriving, right? We need to replace an economy of wants with an economy that's thriving. And it's just like such a middle class Christmas hamper of bullshit, right? It just doesn't mean anything. You still got 40% of the world's on like $2 to $5 a day. You have working class people in the north of England who are so dependent on food banks that when the truck shows up with the food, the kids are literally ripping open the sacks. Yes, you can go to my Twitter feed and see a video of that. Like, we're nowhere near thriving. We're nowhere near saying we've got enough that we don't need growth. We need to just be a lot better than that.
Right, and it also completely hides, like, class. It basically, it says that we're all in this together, we're all consuming too much, we're all producing too much, we're all responsible, and actually, no, all of those things are happening at a far greater scale for the people who are actually.
I'm responsible, right? I need to degrowth. But the problem is me and my class have all the money. We also have all the political contacts. We also basically control how things work. So we're not going to do that voluntarily.
Right. And especially after 40, 50 years of austerity, like how do you sell that project to most ordinary people who like, it's not like most people are out buying new luxury goods all the time. It's right now we need stimulus checks because people can't pay their rent. So well, as I like to call them, we need parachute checks to stop people falling into the ground, right? Because people dead in the ground doesn't make for a good economic rebound. But yeah, I mean, I don't know about 40 or 50 years of austerity. I think you misspoke, but nonetheless, yeah, I mean, when you've basically battered the economic circumstances of large numbers of people to the point that, I'll give you the British example. The British economy doubled in size since 1980, and food bank use went from 0 to up to 1,000% over 10 years, right? I mean, in which way is that a good outcome? How can you possibly stand there, as Boris Johnson does, and goes, we are global Britain and this is bloody marvellous. And it's like, really? I mean, your food bank use is up 1,000% in 10 years, right? What is going on? And, that's where we should really be focusing our attention. Right. So Nando has to go in a sec. I gotta
run.
If you don't mind, Nando, one last thing, I guess, because this is kind of the, I think everyone here would agree that part of what we have to do to get out of the pandemic and, neoliberalism broadly is some kind of rebuilding of the welfare state. No, is that fair?
But again, it depends on what you mean by that. Well, first of all, let's think of the idea of rebuilding. That implies that you had one.
Right.
Right.
I think you could say. I think there is a historic moment when we do have this massive new influx of social expenditure going towards whether it's like providing public goods, whether it's healthcare or other things, or transfers, Social Security, things like that. Like that's historically unprecedented, no?
Well, yeah, I mean, everything's historically unprecedented until you've done it. I mean, why is it the only thing the American left can celebrate was 90 years ago when an aristocrat turned on his own class in a moment of utter desperation to stave off American fascism? I mean, what did they actually do? Well, what did they actually do? I mean, they electrified the South. Well, you probably should have, right? They put in unemployment insurance. So did everybody else, right? But you still have state-based unemployment insurance. You excluded African Americans and women from the entire original New Deal. I mean, come on, let's put this in perspective. If you want to build something, think of something that's worthwhile for the 21st century that actually makes a difference in the lives of working people, rather than harking back to bloody Roosevelt one more time.
Well, so my question is, what is the first step? I think there has to be some ordering of priorities, right? That we should have.
There are, but as left-leaning but well-meaning academics like me, don't ask us, right? We are the class that's the problem. This is for you and your generation to sit around and think about what is actually going to make a difference for you. You're the one that's facing a carbon-shocked future, right? You're the one that's facing a future where you start with debt and no assets, such that the poverty rate on old people in the United States lies between 4% and 7%, and the poverty rate on millennials is 20%. Right? This is the food bank's point, right? We've normalized the absurd. Your job is not to think about which bit of the welfare state we're going to challenge that. Denormalize the absurd. Show that it's absurd. That's what gets people to go, oh, yeah, really, you're right. That's bloody awful. We shouldn't be doing that. And then once you do that and you can build upon that politically, that's when you can have those questions. Otherwise, it's just like sitting around and going, and then we will tell the Federal Reserve to do this with the Treasury. And it's like, great. And I will tell the Klingons to make peace with the Vulcans. So what?
Fair.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it. Kale, it's on you to figure out the problems of the world. Don't ask us.
Exactly. No, Nando, I'm sorry. You're not nearly as old as me.
No, I'm on your team. I don't want to figure it out.
No.
I don't want to figure it out.
No. There's a place for critique and there's a place for action, and the two of them are meant to go together. Go read your Rosa Luxemburg.
There you go. Well, Mark, thank you so much for talking. I can't tell you how much fun this was. I've been wanting to talk to you for many, many years. This really was a great honor, and most of all, a lot of fun. And I really appreciate it. I learned a lot. I think the audience probably learned a lot, and I think we all had a good laugh.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Please don't send me any Twitter hate mail about MMT because I'm not going to reply. I'm just not. And I hope this was better than whatever's on Netflix.
Trust me, it is. All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.